Okay, this is a quick comparison of some of the delays on the Line 6 Helix and some of the delays on the Strymon timeline. My clean tone is a 5150 50 watt head into an Egnator Tourmaster 4x12 with vintage 30 speakers. Okay, so let's start off with the Helix. I've loaded the Mod Chorus Echo model. I've tweaked it a little bit to sound fairly close to the timeline. Over to the timeline. Back to the Helix. Timeline. So, to me, right off the bat, there isn't that much difference. But it's really when you get to the processing of these delays when the differences become more apparent. So since we're on the timeline, let's go for some filtering. So if we turn this up to about 1, 2 o'clock. You start to get some very nice filtering. Now, if I want to do a similar thing on the Helix, what I can do with the Mod Chorus Echo model is I can adjust the low cut and the high cut. So it sounds like the timeline is rolling off the highs quite severely, but also some of the lows. So I'm just going to tweak these, not to any particular numbers, just to taste. That sounds a little dark, so I'll bring the high cut up a bit. Now, as you can hear, that was very, very bright in comparison. So there's going to be a sweet spot in between whatever it was, 970 and 3 kilohertz. That's starting to resemble the timeline. Let's bring the low cut down so that we keep some of our bass frequencies. Let's go back to the timeline. Back to the Helix. Tweak that high cut again, maybe 1 kilohertz. Jump up 1 point at a time until we get the character that we're after. Yeah, I think I like it at 1.5. So back to the timeline. Back to the Helix. So let's go back to the timeline. We'll bring the filter down a little bit, but we'll turn up the repeats. And let's see if we can get some nice oscillations going on. So when you tweak the controls, you can hear that the delay almost sits on the edge of totally feeding back and going crazy. And that's a really nice sound, and to be able to get that from a digital delay, I think is really cool. So let's try getting a similar thing with the Helix. So we know that we want our feedback to be fairly high. I'm also going to increase the mix slightly. Let's bring the low cut up quite high. I'm not going to touch any of the modulation parameters just yet. So you can hear that we're almost there. Maybe a little bit more feedback. We might want some more highs at this point. So you can hear that just a minor tweak on the high cut has made a massive difference to the tone there. So back to the Helix. Sorry, the timeline. Now back to the Helix. So to my ears, the timeline sounds a little dirtier with these particular parameters and this particular sound that I'm aiming for. But it's almost... It's dirtier, I would say, than the Helix, but because of that, it sounds more analog. Whereas the Helix is slightly cleaner, and it kind of sounds like digital pretending to be analog, if that makes sense. But I think both are really good sounds. So, getting rid of the filtery business. And you can see workflow-wise on the timeline, it's a single knob. But on the Helix, obviously I'm having to tweak two parameters. That might factor into, you know, your impression of each of these units. Let's bring the delay down a bit so that we're not going to drown ourselves in repeats. And let's check out some modulation. So Helix first, we'll set the mod mode. We've got a choice of chorus or vibrato. We'll set it to chorus. I'm going to set the speed to 0.3 and the depth to about 20%. And if we go over to the timeline, I'm going to have a fairly slow speed and the depth about 11 o'clock. So you can already hear there that it's not as pronounced as the Helix. So I'm going to increase the depth. You can hear a little bit of a pitch bend coming in at the end there. Maybe if we have a little bit more speed. So to me, they both sound quite different off the bat. Back to the Helix. Helix sounds much more processed, but if we flip this to vibrato, bring the depth down to 15%. Still really processed actually. We might even need to be a bit more subtle with the depth. Back to the timeline. So yeah, they sound very different. The timeline sounds like it's modulating certain parameters within the algorithm, whereas the Helix sounds like an actual audio effect, as opposed to changing playback rates and buffer sizes and that sort of thing within the algorithm. Sticking with the timeline, let's crank these up and just explore a little bit. Very squirrely. Let's bring the speed down to about noon. With the timeline, for my tastes, it doesn't quite go deep enough. If we come back to the Helix, come back over to this panel, even a depth of 16%, if we bring the speed up sort of halfway-ish, go back to chorus mode. That's just a bit more pleasing to my ears. I like the affected nature of it. Timeline. So, the other parameter that the timeline gives you is the grit control. So I'm turn all the modulation off. Turn this up a little bit. You can get a very pleasing distortion on the digital mode on the timeline, and indeed on all of the modes. You can't really do that very easily on the Helix, certainly with the mod chorus echo algorithm. You could do some funky routing to route it into a distortion pedal and get a similar sound, but just right off the bat, you can't really get it. But yeah, as a vanilla digital delay, they're both fairly similar, and they both can sound very good. It just depends what you want. Bring the mix up on the timeline all the way, 100%. Bring it down just a touch so we get a little bit of my original guitar. Do a similar thing with the Helix, say 90%, 91%. See, actually at 91%, you're not really hearing much of my original guitar, so I'm going to have to back that down even more. So yeah, that's something I hadn't really noticed before. The way that the mix works is actually quite different between the two pedals, because when my mix is almost at full on the timeline, my dry guitar is still very pronounced. Whereas with the Helix, it's a lot quieter, and I seem to have to set it to about 60%, whereas judging by the knob cap position on the timeline, that's kind of 90-95%. So the weighting of the mix parameter is different on each pedal. So that's a quick comparison, or a not so quick comparison, of the digital sounds from each of these units. Coming up, I'm going to maybe do some analog sounds.